The moment the old violin case clicked open on the auction house counter, 3 of the most respected instrument restorers in the country started laughing. Not quietly, not politely. The kind of laughter that fills a room and bounces off walls, and makes the person standing on the other side of the counter feel about 2 inches tall. The violin inside was a wreck. The top plate had split clean through near the bass bar, the neck had snapped and been badly re-glued decades ago, probably by someone who had no business touching it. The varnish was gone in patches, replaced by something brown and synthetic, that caught the light in a way original Cremonese finish never would. Water damage had warped the ribs slightly. One of the fine tuners had been replaced with a hardware store screw. Sylvana Breck, the auction director at Heathcroft Fine Instruments in Toronto, set the case down carefully on the counter and folded her hands. She had seen damaged instruments before. She had not often seen one this damaged arrive, with the calm expectation that something might be saved. "Mr. Voss," she said, choosing her words with the particular precision of someone delivering news they have delivered many times. "I appreciate you bringing this in, but I have to be honest with you. What you have here isn't a restoration project, it's a parts donor, at best." The 2 men behind her, both senior appraisers with combined credentials that filled half a wall, nodded without looking up from their phones. Standing across the counter, a man in a faded flannel jacket with calluses on both hands, and a small scuff of sawdust on his left boot, said nothing for a long moment. Then Peter Voss said 4 words that nobody in that room took seriously. "I'd like to try." Nobody watching from the doorway that afternoon could have guessed that what happened next would be talked about 12 months later, inside some of the most prestigious concert halls in the country. They only saw a quiet widower, with oil under his fingernails and no formal credentials, holding a ruined violin like it was something worth keeping. What nobody in that room knew was what that violin was, and what it had cost him to bring it there. Peter Voss was 42 years old, and lived in Sudbury, Ontario, in a house that had been slightly too big since his wife Ruth died 3 years earlier. The house had 4 bedrooms because they had planned on more children after their daughter Maisie. Then Ruth was diagnosed. Then she was gone inside 14 months. And then it was just Peter and Maisie, in a 4-bedroom house in Sudbury, with a mortgage and a grief so heavy. It took about a year before Peter could watch television again, without feeling the absence of the person who used to sit beside him on the couch. He worked at a small instrument repair shop on Elm Street called Birchwood Repair. Not the kind of place that got written up in magazines. The kind of place where local school kids brought student-grade clarinets with stuck keys, and elderly men brought brass instruments from the 40s that needed pads, and nothing else. Peter had worked there for 11 years, he was the only full-time luthier on staff, and he was good, genuinely good, at what he did. But Sudbury was not a city that put a lot of money into fine instrument restoration, and so his skills mostly went toward fixing what was practical, rather than what was beautiful. He had studied at the Newark School of Violin Making in England, before coming back to Canada. He had trained under a Czech restorer named Karel Horak in Montreal for 2 years after graduation. He had, at 28, possessed the kind of precise and patient hands that older craftsmen sometimes noticed and quietly remarked upon. But life had a way of rerouting people. Ruth had family in Sudbury. They had moved. Maisie was born. The years passed. Carol retired and died 2 winters ago, and Peter Voss, who had once dreamed of restoring instruments of historic significance, now fixed student-grade clarinets and reglued bridges on mid-range cellos and tried to be home before Maisie got off the school bus. She was 9 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and a habit of collecting things that needed fixing. Broken radios, cracked ceramic figures, clocks that didn't tick. She kept them in a row on her windowsill, and sometimes asked Peter to help her, and those were the evenings he felt most like himself. Ruth had played violin, amateur, not professional, but she had played with the kind of unself-conscious love that made people stop talking and just listen. When she died, she left behind a practice violin, a good bow, and a box of rosin and strings Peter could not bring himself to open. He had stored these in the basement, and tried not to look at them. Then, 8 months after Ruth's death, a package arrived. It came from Ruth's great-aunt Marguerite, who lived outside Quebec City, and whom Peter had met exactly twice in his life. The letter inside explained that Marguerite was 91 years old, had no children, and had spent 60 years in possession of something she now believed should come to Peter. She had known Ruth was a musician. She had known Ruth married a man who worked with instruments. She thought it was right. Inside the package, wrapped in an old wool scarf, and then in brown paper, was the violin. Marguerite's letter explained what it was in the careful handwriting of someone who had been told a story once and tried not to forget it. The violin had belonged to Marguerite's own grandmother, a woman who had emigrated from France to Quebec in the early 1900s. That grandmother had received it as a gift, from a musician she had helped during a difficult winter. The musician's name was not a famous one, but the instrument itself, according to the single document tucked inside the case, was dated 1887, and bore an interior label that Marguerite had always assumed was simply decorative. Peter knew within 10 minutes of opening that case that it was not decorative. The label was faded but legible, the maker's name, the city, the year. He sat on the kitchen floor with the violin in his hands and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have words for. He thought about calling someone. He thought about Carl, who was already dead. He sat there for a long time. Then Maisie came downstairs for a glass of water, and found him on the floor with a broken violin, and tears running down his face, and she sat down beside him without asking questions, and leaned her head against his arm. That was the night Peter decided he was going to try to restore it. The research took 4 months. Peter worked on the violin's history the way he worked on everything, methodically, without rushing, checking twice before touching anything. He wrote to the Canadian Conservation Institute. He corresponded with a professor at McGill, who specialized in French and Italian stringed instruments from the 19th century. He hired a dendrochronologist, a wood dating specialist, through a university contact in Waterloo, who confirmed that the spruce in the top plate was consistent with late 19th century alpine harvesting patterns. Nothing was definitive. That was the nature of old instruments. Labels were moved. Documents were lost. Provenance was complicated by wars and emigration and time. But everything Peter uncovered pointed in the same direction, and after 4 months, he was confident enough in what he believed this instrument to be, that he felt the restoration could not wait any longer. The violin needed more than he could do alone, or rather, more than he had the materials to do alone. He needed specific hide glue sourced to period specifications. He needed varnish components that matched the chemical signature of the original. He needed wood for the neck graft. Quarter-sawn maple of the right age and grain. That birchwood repair simply did not stock. He called Heathcroft Fine Instruments in Toronto because they were the most serious dealer of historical stringed instruments in Ontario. He explained what he believed he had. He was given an appointment. The appointment was the afternoon of the laughter. Sylvana Breck did not mean to be unkind. She was a professional, and her professional opinion was that the instrument was damaged beyond practical restoration. What she did not know, what none of the 3 people in that room knew, was the extent of Peter's training, the depth of his research, or what he had already figured out about the structural integrity hidden beneath the damage. What looked like a catastrophic top plate split to the appraisers was, to Peter, a split that had occurred along the grain, in a way that preserved the acoustic geometry almost entirely. The bad re-glue on the neck was ugly, but the original neck root was intact. The synthetic varnish was a problem, but it was a surface problem. The ribs were warped but not cracked. Peter did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He asked Sylvana very quietly if he could speak with her privately for 10 minutes. She agreed, mostly to be polite. 30 minutes later, she had reviewed his research documentation, his dendrochronology report, his correspondence with the McGill professor, and his written assessment of the structural condition. She sat back in her chair and looked at him for a long moment. "If you're right about what this is," she said, "this violin belongs in a museum, or on a concert stage." "I know," Peter said, "and you want to restore it yourself." "Yes, why not bring it to one of the major restoration houses? There are people in Montreal, in London." "Because," Peter said, and stopped. He looked at the case on the desk between them. "Because it came to me from my wife's family. Because my wife played violin. Because I have been repairing instruments for 20 years, and this is the only time in my life I have held something like this." He paused. "And because I think I can do it." Sylvana was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from us?" she said. Heathcroft agreed to loan Peter access to their conservation lab on evenings and weekends for 6 months, on the condition that the restoration was documented, and that Heathcroft would have the first right of appraisal afterward. They also connected him with their materials supplier, which gave him access to the hide glue, the varnish components, and, through a contact in Germany, the quarter-sawn maple he needed for the neck graft. Peter drove 4 hours from Sudbury to Toronto every other Friday after Maisie's school day ended, with Maisie in the back seat, eating crackers and doing her homework. They stayed in a budget hotel near the Annex. Maisie had discovered, somewhere around the 3rd trip, that she liked the hotel's continental breakfast better than anything Peter made at home, and she began referring to the Toronto trips as the breakfast trips. Peter worked in the conservation lab on Friday evenings and most of Saturday. Maisie did her weekend homework at a small table in the corner, under a lamp, occasionally passing him tools when he asked. She had learned the names of most of them. She knew the difference between a purfling cutter and a palette knife. She had once, carefully and with great seriousness, handed him a spool of linen thread as if she were assisting in surgery. The restoration was slow. Removing the synthetic varnish required patience that most people in the modern world have forgotten existed. Peter worked under magnification, with cotton swabs and solvent diluted to a concentration that took hours of testing to determine. The top plate repair required cleating from the inside with linen and hide glue, applying pressure with custom bent cawls, fitted to the exact curvature of the instrument. The neck graft took 3 attempts before he was satisfied with the fit. On the evenings when he worked late, and Maisie had fallen asleep in her coat, on the small cot in the corner of the lab, the blanket Peter kept folded in the supply cabinet, now semi-permanently draped over her. The Heathcroft staff who passed by sometimes slowed down to look through the window, not because the work was showy. Because it wasn't. Because there was something in the quality of attention Peter brought to the instrument, the way he held it, the way he looked at it before touching it, that people found difficult to look away from. Silvana stopped in one Thursday evening, unannounced, on her way back from a client dinner. She found Peter under the lamp with the half-restored violin and Maisie asleep in the corner. She watched through the glass for a minute before he noticed her. She knocked. He waved her in. "How is it going?" she said quietly, not wanting to wake Maisie. "Slowly," Peter said. "The way it should." She looked at the instrument under the lamp. Even unfinished, something had changed. The wood had been cleaned back to itself. The splits were closed. The grain of the top plate caught the light the way it was supposed to. "It's remarkable," she said. "It was always remarkable," Peter said. "It just needed someone to listen to it." What Peter did not know during those months, what he could not have anticipated, was what was happening at Heathcroft, in the rooms he was not part of. Silvana had made some calls. She was careful about it, because the provenance was still not confirmed, and she was a professional, but she had shared the dendrochronology report and the documentation with 2 colleagues she trusted. One in Edinburgh, one in Paris, and received responses that left her sitting very still at her desk for a considerable time. The Edinburgh colleague had cross-referenced the construction details with a catalogue of instruments attributed to a specific regional workshop from the late 1880s. 7 known instruments from this workshop were in major collections worldwide. The construction signatures Peter had documented aligned with the others in the catalogue. This did not confirm the attribution. It did, however, make it impossible to dismiss. By the time Peter brought the violin to Heathcroft for the final appointment, the formal unveiling and appraisal, 9 months after he had first walked through the door being laughed at, the story had traveled, quietly, as real stories tend to. A musicologist from the University of Toronto would be there. A curator from the Canadian Museum of History had requested an invitation. 2 collectors, both discreetly significant, had asked to attend. And the 2 senior appraisers who had laughed that first afternoon would also be present. Because Silvana had invited them specifically. Peter drove down from Sudbury the morning of the unveiling. Maisie was in the back seat, unusually quiet, wearing the dress she wore to school concerts. She had asked Peter 2 weeks earlier if she could come. He had said yes before she finished the sentence. He carried the case himself. He always carried it himself. The room at Heathcroft was not enormous, but it felt full. 15 or 20 people, the lighting was careful. Silvana met him at the door and touched his arm briefly, a small specific gesture, and led him to the center of the room. Peter set the case on the table. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the people in the room. He found Maisie at the edge of the group, standing very straight in her concert dress, watching him with the exact expression Ruth used to wear when she was paying attention to something important. He opened the case. The silence in the room was immediate and total. The violin was, there is no other word for it, alive, not in any mystical sense. In the most precise and technical sense, it had been returned to the acoustic geometry it was designed to hold. The varnish Peter had formulated through 2 months of testing, and 17 failed batches, caught the light the way old Italian and French varnish does. Warmly, variably, with a depth that synthetic finishes can imitate for about 30 seconds, before you see through them. The neck graft was invisible. The repaired top plate was seamless under normal light, visible only under ultraviolet, which is exactly where it should be. One of the musicologists stepped forward without being invited. He bent close, he looked for a long time. "Can it be played?" he said. Peter looked at Maisie. Maisie walked forward, picked up the bow that lay beside the violin in the case. Ruth's bow, which Peter had rehaired the week before, and set the violin under her chin. She had been taking lessons for 2 years. She was not a prodigy. She played with the focused, effortful concentration of a 9-year-old who loves something and is not yet effortless at it. She played the first 8 bars of the Suzuki piece. She had learned that term, simple, unhurried. The sound that came out of that instrument was extraordinary, not because of Maisie, though her teachers would later describe the recording someone made on their phone as evidence of genuine feel, but because of what the violin itself did with those simple notes. The resonance, the depth on the lower strings, the way the sound expanded and filled the room, and then kept expanding. When Maisie finished and lowered the bow, the room was still quiet. Then the musicologist from the University of Toronto said, very softly, "Good Lord." The formal attribution would take another 8 months, and the involvement of 3 international experts. It was not the kind of thing that happened quickly or without rigor. Peter understood this, and was patient. What happened first, before the attribution, before the museum conversations, before the newspaper coverage that came later, was what Silvana did in the parking lot after the unveiling. She walked out after him. He was loading the case into the back of his car. Maisie was already in the front seat, still in her concert dress, eating a granola bar someone had given her. "Peter," Silvana said. He turned. She was a careful woman, a professional. She did not often say things she had not planned to say. "I would like to discuss something," she said. "Not today, when you're ready. I've been thinking about what we do with historical instrument restoration in this country. How little infrastructure there is for it. How many instruments like this one are sitting in basements and attics, because there is nobody to look at them seriously." She paused. "I would like to discuss whether you might consider leading a restoration program here. Something with real resources. A team eventually. We have the network, we have collectors who would fund it." She paused again. "What we don't have is someone with your knowledge and your hands." Peter looked at her. He thought about Carol Horak in his Montreal workshop. The smell of hide glue and linseed oil. The way Carol used to say that the instrument tells you what it needs if you are willing to be quiet enough to hear it. He thought about Ruth, who had played violin the way people do when they are not performing for anyone. He thought about Maisie on the kitchen floor beside him the night he opened Marguerite's package, leaning against his arm without asking questions. "I'd need to bring Maisie," he said finally. "I'd need to find a school. Toronto has schools," Silvana said. He was quiet for a long moment. "Can I think about it for a few days?" "Of course," she said. He got in the car. Maisie looked up at him with her mother's eyes. "What did she want?" Maisie asked. "She wants us to move to Toronto," Peter said. Maisie considered this with the particular seriousness she brought to most things. Then she said, "Does the hotel have the same breakfast?" Peter almost laughed, he almost cried, he did neither. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel. "Different hotel," he said, "but probably breakfast." "Okay," Maisie said, and went back to her granola bar. The 2 appraisers who had laughed that first afternoon did not say anything to Peter directly after the unveiling. One of them found Silvana later, and said the restoration was impressive. She thanked him without elaborating. What she did not say, what she kept to herself, was that she had watched them both look at the violin when Maisie played. She had watched the moment the sound reached them. The way they went still, the way the laughter from that first afternoon had nowhere left to stand. Some moments do not require commentary. There is something that gets said often about grief, that it ends, or that it passes, or that time heals it. Peter would not have described it that way. He would have said that grief changes what you are capable of noticing, that it makes certain things more visible, that after Ruth died, he became a person who could not afford to be careless with what mattered. The violin had mattered not because of what it out to be worth, which was significant, not because of the attribution, which was eventually confirmed and reported in a manner that reached people who paid attention to such things, but because it came from Ruth's family, because it had been carried across an ocean and stored in an attic for 60 years, and nearly lost a dozen times between then and the afternoon. Marguerite wrapped it in an old wool scarf and mailed it to a grieving man's in Sudbury, who might understand what it was. The program at Heathcroft, which was named, at Peter's request, for Karel Horak, opened the following autumn. It was the first dedicated historical instrument restoration program housed within a private institution in Canada. In the first year, 3 instruments came through the program that had been sitting unexamined in private collections for decades. One of them turned out to be something significant. 2 of them were not, but were beautiful anyway, and were repaired and returned to use. Peter was home for dinner every evening. That had been a condition. Maisie found a school she liked in the Annex neighborhood, 10 minutes walk from Heathcroft, with a music program. She continued her violin lessons. She was not a prodigy, she was a child who loved something, which is better. On quiet evenings in the Heathcroft lab, when the work was going well, and the light was right, and the instrument under his hands was giving back what he gave it, Peter sometimes thought about the afternoon in Sudbury, when he had opened a package from an old woman he barely knew and sat down on the kitchen floor and wept. He thought about what it had taken to carry that case to Toronto and stand in front of people who laughed. He had thought that sometimes the thing you are carrying, the broken thing, the thing everyone else has dismissed, the thing that does not look like much from the outside, turns out to be the thing that was waiting for you all along. And sometimes the people who laughed are standing in the room when you find out. If you have ever held on to something that others told you to throw away, something that mattered to you even when it made no practical sense, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're watching from somewhere in Canada, or anywhere in the world, tell us where you are in the comments. These stories find the people who need them. This one might be meant for someone you know.